Part 1 of Chapter 6 of The Abandoned Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Abandoned Room by Wadsworth Camp. The One Who Stepped in the Private Staircase. Chapter 6, Section 1. The odd, mournful crying lost itself in the restless lament of the wind. The thicket from which it had seemed to issue assumed in the pallid moonlight a new unfriendliness. Instinctively the 6 men moved closer together. The coroner's thin tones expressed his alarm. "What the devil was that? I don't really believe there could be a woman around here." "A queer one," the detective grunted. The district attorney questioned Bobby and Graham. "That's the voice you heard from the house?" Graham nodded. "Perhaps not so far away." Dr. Groom, hitherto more captured than any of them by the imminence of a spiritual responsibility for the mystery of the Cedars, was the first now to reach for a rational explanation of this new phase. "We mustn't let our fancies run away with us. The coroner's right for once. No excuse for a woman hiding in that thicket. A bird, maybe, or some animal." "Sounded more like a human being," Robinson objected. The detective reasoned in a steady, unmoved voice. "Only a mad woman would wander through the woods crying like that, without a special purpose. This man, Paredes, has left the house and come through here. I guess it was a signal." "Graham and I had thought of that," Bobby said. "Howells was a sharp one," Robinson mused, "but he must have gone wrong on this fellow. He'd phoned me the man knew nothing. Spoke of him as a foreigner who lolled around smoking cigarettes and trying to make a fool of him with a lot of talk about ghosts." "Howells," Graham said, "misjudged the case from the start. He wasn't to blame, but his mistake cost him his life." Robinson didn't answer. Bobby saw that the man had discarded his intolerant temper. From that change he drew a new hope. He accepted it as a beginning of fulfillment of his prophecy last night that an accident to Howells and the entrance of a new man into the case would give him a fighting chance. It was clearly Paredes at the moment who filled the district attorney's mind. "Go after him," he said shortly to Rawlins. "If you can get away with it, bring him back and whoever you find with him." Rawlins hesitated. "I'm no coward, but I know what's happened to Howells. This isn't an ordinary case. I don't want to walk into an ambush. It would be safer not to run him down alone." "All right," Robinson agreed. "I don't care to leave the Cedars for the present. Perhaps Mr. Graham." But Graham wasn't enthusiastic. It never occurred to Bobby that he was afraid. Graham, he guessed, desired to remain near Katherine. "I'll go if you like," Dr. Groom rumbled. It was probable that Graham's instinct to stay had sprung from service rather than sentiment. The man, it was reasonable, sought to protect Katherine from the Cedars itself and from Robinson's too direct methods of examination. As an antidote for his unwelcome jealousy, Bobby offered himself to Rawlins. "Would you mind if I came, too? I've known Paredes a long time." Robinson sneered. "What do you think of that, Rawlins?" But the detective stepped close and whispered in the district attorney's ear. "All right," Robinson said. "Go with him, if you want, Mr. Blackburn." And Bobby knew that he would go, not to help, but to be watched. The others strayed toward the house. The 3 men faced the entrance of the path alone. "No more loud talk now," the detective warned. "If he went on tiptoe, so can we." Even with this company, Bobby shrank from the dark and restless forest. With a smooth skill, the detective followed the unfamiliar path. From time to time he stooped close to the ground, shaded his lamp with his hand, and pressed the control. Always the light verified the presence of Paredes ahead of them. Bobby knew that they were near the stagnant lake. The underbrush was thicker. They went with more care to limit the sound of their passage among the trees, and each moment the physical surroundings of the pursuit increased Bobby's doubt of Paredes. No ordinary impulse would bring a man to such a place in this black hour before the dawn, particularly Paredes, who spoke constantly of his superstitious nature, who advertised a thorough-paced fear of the Cedars. The Panamanian's decision to remain, his lack of emotion before the tragic succession of events at the house, his attempt to enter the corridor just before Bobby had gone himself to the old room for the evidence, his desire to direct suspicion against Catherine. Finally, this excursion in response to the eerie crying all suggested a definite, perhaps a dangerous, purpose in the brain of the serene and inscrutable man. They slipped to the open space about the lake. The moon barely distinguished for them the flat, melancholy stretch of water. They listened breathlessly. There was no sound beyond the normal stirrings of the forest. Bobby had a feeling, similar to the afternoons, that he was watched. He tried unsuccessfully to penetrate the darkness across the lake where he had fancied the woman skulking. The detective's keen senses were satisfied. $1 to doughnuts, they're not here. They've probably gone on. I'll have to take a chance and show the light again. Fresh footprints were revealed in the narrow circle of illumination, testifying to Paredes' continued stealth. They made a straight line to the water's edge. Rawlins exclaimed, "He stepped into the lake. How deep is it?" The black surface of the water seemed to Bobby like an opaque glass, hiding sinister things. Suppose Paredes, instead of coming to a rendezvous, had been led. "It's deep enough in the center," he answered. "Shallow around the edges." "Quite." "Then he knew we were after him," Groom said. Rawlins nodded and ran his light along the shore. A few yards to the right, a ledge of smooth rock stretched from the water to a grove of pine trees. The detective arose and turned off his light. "He's blocked us," he said. He knew he wouldn't leave his marks on the rock or the pine needles. No way to guess his direction now. Dr. Groom cleared his throat. With a hesitant manner, he recited the discovery of the queer light in the deserted house, its unaccountable disappearances, their failure to find its source. "I was thinking," he explained, "that Paredes alone saw the light give out. It was his suggestion that he go to the front of the house to investigate. This path might be used as a shortcut to the deserted house. The rendezvous may have been there." Rawlins was interested again. "How far is it?" "Not much more than a mile," Groom answered. "Then we'll go," the detective decided. "Show the way." Groom in the lead, they struck off through the woods. Bobby, who walked last, noticed the faint messengers of dawn behind the trees in the east. He was glad. The night cloaked too much in this neighborhood. By daylight the empty house would guard its secret less easily. Suddenly he paused and stood quite still. He wanted to call to the others, to point out what he had seen. There was no question. By chance he had accomplished the task that seemed so hopeless yesterday. He had found the spot where his consciousness had come back momentarily to record a wet moon, trees straining in the wind like puny men, and a figure in a mask which he called his conscience. He gazed, his hope retreating before an unforeseen disappointment. For with the paling moon and the bent trees survived that very figure on the discovery of whose nature he had built so vital a hope. And in this bad light it conveyed to him an appearance nearly human. Through the underbrush The trunk of a tree shattered by some violent storm mocked him with its illusion. The dead leaves at the top were like cloth across a face. Therefore, he argued, there had been no conspiracy against him. Paredes was clean as far as that was concerned. He had wandered about the cedars alone. He had opened his eyes at a point between the court and the deserted house. Rawlins turned back suspiciously, asking why he loitered. He continued almost indifferently. He still wanted to know Paredes' goal, but his disappointment and its meaning obsessed him. When they crept up, the growing light exposed the scars of the deserted house. Everything was as Bobby remembered it. At the front there was no decayed wood or vegetation to strengthen the doctor's half-hearted theory of a phosphorescent emanation. The tangle of footsteps near the rear door was confusing, and it was some time before the three men straightened and glanced at each other, knowing that the doctor's wisdom was proved. For Paredes had been there recently, for that matter, might still be in the house. Moreover, he hadn't hidden his tracks as he could have done in the thick grass. Instead, he had come in a straight line from the woods across a piece of sandy ground which contained the record of his direction and his continued stealth. But inside they found nothing except burnt-out matches strewn across the floor, testimony of their earlier search. The fugitive had evidently left more carefully than he had come. The chill emptiness of the deserted house had drawn and released him ahead of the chase. I guess he knew what the light meant, the detective said, as well as he did that queer calling. It complicates matters that I can't find a woman's footprints around here. She may have kept to the grass and this marked-up path, for since I don't believe in banshees, I'll swear there's been a woman around, either a crazy woman wandering at large who might be connected with the murders, or else a sane one who signaled the foreigner. Let's get back and see what the district attorney makes of it. It might be wiser not to dismiss the banshees, as you call them, too hurriedly, Dr. Groom rumbled. As they returned along the road in the growing light, Bobby lost the feeling he had had of being spied upon. The memory of such an adventure was bound to breed something like confidence among its actors. Rawlins, Bobby hoped, would be less unfriendly. The detective, in fact, talked as much to him as to the doctor. He assured them that Robinson would get the Panamanian unless he proved miraculously clever. He's shown us that he knows something, he went on. I don't say how much, because I can't get a motive to make it worth his while to commit such crimes. The man smiled blandly at Bobby. While in your case there's a motive at least. The money. He chuckled. That's the easiest motive to understand in the world. It's stronger than love. Bobby wondered. Love had been the impulse for the last few months' folly that had led him into his present situation. Graham, over his stern principles of right, had already stepped outside the law in backing Catherine's efforts to save Bobby. So he wondered how much Graham would risk, how far he was capable of going himself, at the inspiration of such a motive. The sun was up when they reached the Cedars. Catherine had gone to her room. The coroner had left. Robinson and Graham had built a fresh fire in the hall. They sat there, talking. "Where you been?" Robinson demanded. "We'd about decided the spooks had done for you." The detective outlined their failure. The district attorney listened with a frown. At the end he arose and, without saying anything, walked to the telephone. When he returned he appeared better satisfied. "Mr. Paredes," he said, "will have to be a slick article to make a clean getaway, and I'm bringing another man to keep reporters out. They'll know from Howell's murder that Mr. Blackburn didn't die a natural death. If reporters get in, don't talk to them. I don't want that damn foreigner reading in the papers what's going on here. I'd give my job to have him in that chair for 5 minutes now." Graham cleared his throat. "I scarcely know how to suggest this, since it's sufficiently clear, because of Howell's suspicions, that you have Mr. Blackburn under close observation. But he has a fair idea of Paredes' habits, his haunts, and his friends in New York. He might be able to learn things the police couldn't. I've 1 or 2 matters to take me to town. I would make myself personally responsible for his return." The district attorney interrupted. "I see what you mean. Wait a minute." He clasped his hands and rolled his fat thumbs one around the other. The little eyes, surrounded by puffy flesh, became enigmatic. All at once he glanced up with a genial smile. "Why not? I haven't said anything about holding Mr. Blackburn as more than a witness." His tone chilled Bobby as thoroughly as a direct accusation would have done. "And," Robinson went on, "the sooner you go, the better. The sooner you get back, the better." Graham was visibly puzzled by this prompt acquiescence. He started for the stairs, but the district attorney waved him aside. "Coats and hats are downstairs. No need wasting time." Graham turned to Dr. Groom. "You'll tell Miss Perrine, Doctor." The doctor showed that he understood the warning Graham wished to convey. The district attorney made a point of walking to the stable to see them off. Graham gestured angrily as they drove away. "It's plain as the nose on your face. I was too anxious to test their attitude toward you, Bobby. He jumped at the chance to run us out of the house. He'll have several hours during which to turn the place upside down, to give Catherine the 3rd degree. And we can't go back. We'll have to see it through. Why should he give me a chance to slip away?" Bobby asked. But before long he realized that Robinson was taking no chances. At the junction of the road from Smithtown, a car picked them up and clung to their heels all the way to the city. "Rawlins must have telephoned," Graham said, "while we went to the stable. They're still playing Howell's game. They'll give you plenty of rope." He drove straight to Bobby's apartment. The elevator man verified their suspicions. Robinson had telephoned the New York police for a search. A familiar type of metropolitan detective met them in the hall outside Bobby's door. "I'm through, gentlemen," he greeted them impudently. Graham faced him in a burst of temper. "The city may have to pay for this outrage." The man grinned. "I should get grey hairs about that." He went on downstairs. They entered the apartment to find confusion in each room. Bureau drawers had been turned upside down. The desk had been examined with a reckless thoroughness. Graham was frankly worried. "I wonder if he found anything. If he did, you won't get out of town." "What could he find?" Bobby asked. "If the court was planted," Graham answered, "why shouldn't these rooms have been?" "After last night, I don't believe the court was planted," Bobby said. In the lower hall, the elevator man handed Bobby the mail that had come since the night of his grandfather's murder. In the car again, he glanced over the envelopes. He tore one open with a surprised haste. "This is Maria's handwriting," he told Graham. He read the hastily scrawled note aloud, with a tone that failed toward the end. "Dear Bobby, you must not, as you say, think me a bad sport. You were very wicked last night. Maybe you were so because of too many of those naughty little cocktails. Why should you threaten poor Maria? And you boasted you were going out to the Cedars to kill your grandfather because you didn't like him any more. So I told Carlos to take you home. I was afraid of a scene in public. Come around, have tea with me. Tell me you forgive me. Tell me what was the matter with you." "She must have written that yesterday morning," Bobby muttered. "Good Lord, Hartley, then it was in my mind. Unless that letter's a plant too," Graham said. Yet how could she know there'd be a search? Why shouldn't she have addressed it to the Cedars, where there was a fair chance of it being opened and read by the police? Why hasn't my man made any report on her? We've a number of questions to ask Maria. But word came down from the dancer's apartment that Maria wasn't at home. When did she go out? Graham asked the hall man. Not since I came on duty at 6 o'clock. Graham slipped a bill in the man's hand. We've an important message for her. We'd better leave it with the maid. When they were alone in the upper hall, he explained his purpose to Bobby. We must know whether she's actually here. If she isn't, if she hasn't been back for the last 24 hours, don't you see? It was yesterday afternoon you thought you saw a woman at the lake, and last night a woman cried about the Cedars. That's going pretty far, Hartley. It's a chance, a physical one. A pretty maid opened the door. Her face was troubled. She studied them with frank disappointment. I thought, she began, that your mistress was coming back, Graham flashed. There was no concealment in the girl's manner. It was certain that Maria was not in the apartment. You remember me? Bobby asked. Yes, you have been here. You are a friend of Mademoiselle's. You can perhaps tell me where she is. Bobby shook his head. The girl spread her hands. She burst out excitedly. What is one to do? I have telephoned the theatre. There was no one there who knew anything at all except that Mademoiselle had not appeared at the performance last night. Graham glanced at Bobby. When, he asked, did you see her last? It was before luncheon yesterday. Did she leave no instructions? Didn't she say when she would be back? The girl nodded. That's what worries me, for she said she would be back after the performance last night. She left no instructions? Graham repeated. Only that if anyone called or telephoned, I was to make no appointments. What am I to do? Perhaps I shouldn't be talking to you. She would never forgive me for an indiscretion. For the present, I advise you to do nothing, Graham said. You can safely leave all that to her managers. I am going to see them now, and I will tell them what you have said. The girl's eyes moistened. Thank you, sir. I have been at my wit's end. Apparently she withheld nothing. She played no part to confuse the dancer's friends. On the way to the manager's office, with the trailing car behind them, Graham reasoned excitedly. For the first time we seem to be actually on the track. Here's a tangible clue that may lead to the heart of the case. Maria pulled the wool over the maid's eyes too. She didn't want her to know her plans, but her instructions show that she had no intention of returning last night. She probably made a beeline for the Cedars. It was probably she that you saw at the lake, probably she who cried last night. If only she hadn't written that note. I can't get the meaning of it. It's up to her managers now. If they haven't heard from her, it's a safe guess she's playing a deep game, connected with the crying and the light at the deserted house and the disappearance of Paredes before dawn. You must realize the connection between that and your condition the other evening after you had left them. Bobby nodded. He began to hope that at the manager's office they would receive no explanation of Maria's absence destructive to Graham's theory. Early as it was, they found a bald-headed man in his shirt sleeves pacing with an air of panic in a blatantly furnished office. Well, he burst out as they entered, my secretary tells me you've come about this temperamental Carmen of mine. Tell me where she is. Quick. Graham smiled at Bobby. The manager ran his fingers across his bald and shining forehead. It's no laughing matter. Then she has definitely disappeared, Graham said. Disappeared? Why did I come down at this ungodly hour except on the chance of getting some word? She didn't even telephone last night. I had to show myself in front of the curtain and give them a spiel about a sudden indisposition. And believe me, gentlemen, audiences ain't what they used to be. Did these ginks sit back and take the show for what it was worth? Not by a darn sight. Flocked to the box office and howled for their money back. If she doesn't appear tonight, I might as well close the house. I'll be ruined. Unless, Graham suggested, you get your press agent to make capital out of her absence. The papers would publish her picture and thousands of people would look her up for you. The manager ceased his perplexed massage of his forehead. He shook hands genially. I thought of that with some frills. Has beautiful dancer met foul play? Millions in jewels on her person when last seen. Old stuff, but they rise to it. That will help, Graham said to Bobby when they were in the car again. The reporters will find Maria quicker than any detective I can put my hand on. My man evidently fell down because she had gone before I got him on the case. At his office, they learned that was the fact. The private detective had been able to get no slightest clue as to Maria's whereabouts. Moreover, Bobby's description of the stranger who had entered the cafe with her merely suggested a type familiar to the Tenderloin. For purposes of identification, it was worthless. Always followed by the car from Smithtown, they went to the hotel where Paredes had lived, to a number of his haunts. Bobby talked with men who knew him, but he learned nothing. Paredes' friends had no word since the man's departure for the Cedars the day before. So they turned their backs on the city, elated by the significance of Maria's absence, yet worried by the search and the watchful car which never lost sight of them. When they were in the country, Graham sighed his relief. You haven't been stopped. Therefore, nothing was found at your apartment. But if that wasn't planted, why should Maria have sent an incriminating note there? Unless, Bobby answered, she told the truth. Unless she was sincere when she mailed it. Unless she learned something important between the time she wrote it and her disappearance from her home. Frankly, Bobby, Graham said, the note and the circumstances under which it came to you are as damaging as the footprints and the handkerchief, but it doesn't tell us how any human being could have entered that room to commit the murders and disturb the bodies. At least we've got one physical fact, and I'm going to work on that. If it is Maria prowling around the Cedars, Bobby said, she's amazingly slippery, and with Paredes gone, what are you going to do with your physical fact? And how does it explain the friendly influence that wiped out my footprints? Is it a friendly or an evil influence that snatched away the evidence and that keeps it secreted? We'll see, Graham said. I'm going after a flesh and blood criminal who isn't you. I'm going to try to find out what your grandfather was afraid of the night of his murder. After a time, he glanced up. You've known Paredes for a long time, Bobby, but I don't think you've ever told me how you met him. A couple of years ago, I should think, Bobby answered. Somebody brought him to the club. I've forgotten who. Carlos was working for a big Panama importing firm. He was trying to interest this chap in the New York end. I saw him off and on after that and got to like him for his quiet manner and a queer, dry wit he had in those days. 2 or 3 months ago, he seemed to fit into my humor, and we became pretty chummy, as you know. Even after last night, I hate to believe he's my enemy. He's your enemy, Graham answered, and last night's the weak joint in his armor. I wonder if Robinson didn't scare him away by threatening to question him. Paredes isn't connected with that company now, is he? I gather he has no regular position. No, he's picked up 1 or 2 temporary things with the fruit companies. More than his running away, the thing that worries me about Carlos is his ridiculous suspicion of Catherine. He told Graham in detail of that conversation. Graham frowned. He opened the throttle wider. Their anxiety increased to know what had happened at the Cedars since their departure. The outposts of the forest imposed silence, closed eagerly about them, seemed to welcome them to its dead loneliness. There was a man on guard at the gate. They hurried past. The house showed no sign of life, but when they entered the court, Bobby saw Catherine at her window, doubtless attracted by the sounds of their arrival. Her face brightened, but she raised her arms in a gesture suggestive of despair. "Does she mean the evidence has been found?" Bobby asked. Graham made no attempt to conceal his real interest, the impulse at the back of all his efforts in Bobby's behalf. "More likely Robinson has worried the life out of her since we've been gone. I oughtn't to have left her. I set the trap myself." End of Chapter 6, Section 1. Part 2 of Chapter 6 of The Abandoned Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Abandoned Room by Wadsworth Camp. The One Who Stepped in the Private Staircase. Chapter 6, Section 2. When they were in the house, their halting curiosity was lost in a vast surprise. The hall was empty, but they heard voices in the library. They hurried across the dining room, pausing in the doorway, staring with unbelieving eyes at the accustomed picture they had least expected to see. Paredes lounged on the divan, smoking with easy indifference. His clothing and his shoes were spotless. He had shaved, and his beard had been freshly trimmed. Rawlins and the district attorney stood in front of the fireplace, studying him with perplexed eyes. The persistence of their regard, even after Bobby's entrance, suggested to him that the evidence remained secreted, that the officers, under the circumstances, were scarcely interested in his return. He was swept himself into an explosive amazement. "Carlos, what the deuce are you doing here?" The Panamanian expelled a cloud of smoke. He smiled, resting after a fatiguing walk. In his unexpected presence, Bobby fancied a demolition of the hope Graham and he had brought back from the city. He couldn't imagine guilt lurking behind that serene manner. "Where did you come from? What were you up to last night?" There was no accounting for Paredes' daring, he told himself, no accounting for his easy gesture now as he drew again at his cigarette and tossed it in the fireplace. "These gentlemen," he said, "have been asking just that question. I'm honored. I had no idea my movements were of such interest. I've told them that I took a stroll. The night was over, there was no point in going to bed, and all day I had been without exercise." "Yet," Graham said harshly, "you've had practically no sleep since you came here." Paredes nodded. "Very distressing, isn't it?" "Maybe," Rawlins sneered. "You'll tell us why you went on tiptoe, and I suppose you didn't hear a woman crying in the woods." "That's just it," Paredes answered. "I did hear something like that, and it occurred to me to follow such a curious sound, so I went on tiptoe, as you call it." "Why?" Robinson exclaimed angrily. "You walked in the lake to hide your tracks." Paredes smiled. "It was very dark. That was chance. Quite silly of me. My feet got wet." "I gather," Rawlins said. "It was chance that took you to the deserted house." Paredes shook his head. "Don't you think I was as much puzzled as the rest of that strange disappearing light? It was as good a place to walk as any." "Where have you been since?" Graham asked. When I had got there, I was tired, Paredes answered. Since it wasn't far to the station, I thought I'd go on into Smithtown and have a bath and rest. But I assure you I've trudged back from the station just now. Suddenly he repeated the apparently absurd formula he had used with Howells. You know, the court seems full of unfriendly things, what the ignorant would call ghosts. I'm Spanish and I know. After a moment he added, the woods too. I shouldn't care to wander through them too much after dark. Robinson stared, but Rawlins brushed the question aside. What hotel did you go to in Smithtown? It's called the New. Nothing could be farther from the fact. Shall I see if that's straight, sir? The district attorney agreed, and Rawlins left the room. Paredes laughed. How interesting. I'm under suspicion. It would be something, wouldn't it, to commit crimes with the devilish ingenuity of these? No, no, Mr. District Attorney, look to the ghosts. They alone are sufficiently clever, but I might say, since you take this attitude, that I don't care to answer any more questions until you discover something that might give you the right to ask them. He laid back on the divan, languidly lighting another cigarette. Graham beckoned Robinson. Bobby followed them out, suspecting Graham's purpose, unwilling that action should be taken too hastily against the Panamanian, for even now guilty knowledge seemed incompatible with Paredes' polished reserve. When he joined the others, indeed, Graham, with an aggressive air, was demanding the district attorney's intentions. If he could elude you so easily last night, it's common sense to put him where you can find him in case of need. He's given you excuse enough. The man's got me guessing, Robinson mused, but there are other elements. What's happened since we left? Graham asked quickly. Have you got any trace of Howell's evidence? Robinson smiled enigmatically, but his failure was apparent. I'm like Howells, he said. I'd risk nearly anything myself to learn how the room was entered, how the crimes were committed, how those poor devils were made to alter their positions. So, Bobby said, you had my rooms in New York searched. You had me followed today. It's ridiculous. Robinson ignored him. He stepped to the front door, opened it, and looked around the court. What did the Sphinx mean about ghosts in the court? They walked out, gazing helplessly at the trampled grass about the fountain, at the melancholy walls, at the partly opened window of the room of mystery. He knows something, Robinson mused. Maybe you're right, Mr. Graham, but I wonder if I oughtn't to go farther and take you all. Graham smiled uncomfortably, but Bobby knew why the official failed to follow that radical course. Like Howells, he hesitated to remove from the Cedars the person most likely to solve its mystery. As long as a chance remained that Howells had been right about Bobby, he would give Silas Blackburn's grandson his head, merely making sure, as he had done this morning, that there should be no escape. He glanced up. I wonder if our foreigner's laughing at me now. Graham made a movement toward the door. We might, he said significantly, find that out without disturbing him. Robinson nodded and led the way silently back to the house. Such a method was repugnant to Bobby, and he followed at a distance. Then he saw from the movements of the two men ahead that the library had again offered the unexpected, and he entered. Paredes was no longer in the room. Bobby was about to speak, but Robinson shook his head angrily, raising his hand in a gesture of warning. All three strained forward, listening, and Bobby caught the sound that had arrested the others. A stealthy scraping that would have been inaudible except through such a brooding silence as pervaded the old house. Bobby's interest quickened at this confirmation of Graham's theory. There was a projection of cold fear, moreover, in its sly allusion. It gave to his memory of Paredes, with his tall, graceful figure, his lack of emotion, his inscrutable eyes, and his pointed beard, a suggestion nearly satanic. For the stealthy scraping had come from behind the closed door of the private staircase. Howells had gone up that staircase. None of them could forget for a moment that it led to the private hall outside the room in which the murders had been committed. It occurred to Bobby that the triumph Graham's face expressed was out of keeping with the man. It disturbed him nearly as thoroughly as Paredes' stealthy presence in that place. "We've got him," Graham whispered. Robinson's bulky figure moved cautiously toward the door. He grasped the knob, swung the door open, and stepped back, smiling his satisfaction. Halfway down the staircase, Paredes leaned against the wall, one foot raised and outstretched, as though an infinitely quiet descent had been interrupted. The exposure had been too quick for his habit. His face failed to hide its discomfiture. His laugh rang false. "Hello. I'm afraid we've caught you, Paredes," Graham said, and the triumph blazed now in his voice. What Paredes did then was more startling, more out of key than any of his recent actions. He came precipitately down. His eyes were dangerous. As Bobby watched the face whose quiet had at last been tempestuously destroyed, he felt that the man was capable of anything under sufficient provocation. "Got me for what?" he snarled. "Tell us why you were sneaking up there in connection with your little excursion before dawn. It suggests a guilty knowledge." Paredes straightened. He shrugged his shoulders. With an admirable effort of will he smoothed the rage from his face. But for Bobby the satanic suggestion lingered. "Why do you suppose I'm here?" he said in a restrained voice that scarcely rose above a whisper. "To help Bobby. I was simply looking around for Bobby's sake." That angered Bobby. He wanted to cry out against the supposed friend who had at last shown his teeth. "That," Graham laughed, "is why you sneaked, why you didn't make any noise, why you lost your temper when we caught you at it." "What about it, Mr. District Attorney?" Robinson stepped forward. "Nothing else to do, Mr. Graham. He's too slippery. I'll put him in a safe place." "You mean," Paredes cried, "that you'll arrest me?" "You've guessed it. I'll lock you up as a material witness." Paredes swung on Bobby. "You'll permit this, Bobby? You'll forget that I'm a guest in your house?" Bobby flushed. "Why have you stayed? What were you doing up there? Answer those questions. Tell me what you want." Paredes turned away. He took a cigarette from his pocket and lighted it. His fingers were not steady. For the first time it became evident to Bobby Paredes was afraid. Rawlins came back from the telephone. He took in the tableau. "What's the rumpus?" "Run this man to Smithtown," Robinson directed. "Lock him up and tell the judge, when he's arraigned in the morning, that I want him held as a material witness." "He was at the hotel in Smithtown all right," Rawlins said. He tapped Paredes' arm. "You coming on this little joyride like a lamb or a lion? Say, you'll find the jail about as comfortable as the new hotel." Paredes smiled. The evil and dangerous light died in his eyes. He became all at once easy and impervious again. "Like a lamb, how else?" "I'm sorry, Carlos," Bobby muttered. "If you'd only say something, if you'd only explain your movements, if you'd only really help." Again Paredes shrugged his shoulders. "Handcuffs?" he asked Rawlins. Rawlins ran his hands deftly over the Panamanian's clothing. "No armed neutrality for me," he grinned. "All right, we'll forget the bracelets since you haven't a gun." Puffing at his cigarette, Paredes got his coat and hat and followed the detective from the house. Robinson and Graham climbed the private staircase to commence another systematic search of the hall, to discover, if they could, the motive for Paredes' stealthy presence there. Bobby accepted greedily this opportunity to find Catherine, to learn from her, undisturbed, what had happened in the house that morning. The meaning, perhaps, of her despairing gesture. When, in response to his knock, she opened her door and stepped into the corridor, he guessed her despair had been an expression of the increased strain of her helplessness in face of Robinson's harsh determination. "He questioned me for an hour," she said, "principally about the heel mark in the court. They cling to that because I don't think they found anything new at the lake. You don't know anything about it, do you, Catherine? You weren't there. You didn't do that for me." "I wasn't there, Bobby. I honestly don't know any more about it than you do. Carlos was in the court," he mused. "Did you know they'd taken him? We found him creeping down the private stairway." There was a hard quality about her gratitude. "I am glad, Bobby. The man makes me shudder, and all morning they seemed more interested in you than in him. They've rummaged every room, even mine." She laughed feverishly. "That's why I've been so upset. They seemed—" She broke off. She picked at her handkerchief. After a moment she looked him frankly in the eyes and continued, "They seemed almost as doubtful of me as of you." He recalled Paredes' suspicion of the girl. "It's nonsense, Catherine, and I'm to blame for that too." She put her fingers to her lips. Her smile was wistful. "Hush, you mustn't blame yourself. You mustn't think of that." Again her solicitude, their isolation in the darkened place, tempted him, aroused impulses nearly irresistible. Her slender figure, the pretty face, grown familiar and more desirable through all these years, swept him to a harsher revolt than he had conquered in the library. In the face of Graham, in spite of his own intolerable position, he knew he couldn't fight that truth eternally. She must have noticed his struggle without grasping its cause, for she touched his hand, and the wistfulness of her expression increased. "I wish you wouldn't think of me, Bobby. It's you we must all think of." He accepted with a cold dismay the sisterly anxiety of her attitude. It made his renunciation easier. He walked away. "Why do you go?" she called after him. He gestured vaguely, without turning. He didn't see her again until dinner time. She was as silent then as she had been the night before when Howells had sat with them, his moroseness veiling a sharp interest in the plan that was to lead to his death. Robinson's mood was very different. He talked a great deal, making no effort to hide his irritation. His failure to find any clue in the private staircase after Paredes' arrest had clearly stimulated his interest in Bobby. The sharp little eyes, surrounded by puffy flesh, held a threat for him. Bobby was glad when the meal ended. Howell's body was taken away that night. It was a relief for all of them to know that the old room was empty again. "I dare say you won't sleep there," Graham said to Robinson. Robinson glanced at Bobby. "Not as things stand," he answered. "The library lounge is plenty good enough for me tonight." Graham went upstairs with Bobby. There was no question about his purpose. He wouldn't repeat last night's mistake. "At least," he said, when the door was closed behind them, "I can see if you do get up and wander about in your sleep. I'd bet a good deal that you won't. If I did, it would be an indication. Granted, it's your custom. What is there to tempt you tonight?" Bobby answered, half jesting. "You've not forgotten Robinson on the library sofa. The man isn't exactly working for me. Tonight he seems almost as unfriendly as Howells was." He yawned. "I ought to sleep now, if ever. I've seldom been so tired. 2 such nights." He hesitated. But I'm glad you're here, Hartley. I can go to sleep with a more comfortable feeling." "Don't worry," Graham said. "You'll sleep quietly enough, and we'll all be better for a good rest." For only a little while they talked of the mystery, while Graham regretted his failure to find any trace of Maria. Their voices dwindled sleepily. Bobby recalled his last thought before losing himself last night. He tried to force from his mind now the threat in Robinson's eyes. He told himself again and again that the man wasn't actually unfriendly. Then the blackness encircled him. He slept. Almost at once it seemed to him he was fighting away, demanding drowsily, "What's the matter? Leave me alone." He heard Graham's voice, unnaturally subdued and anxious. "What are you doing, Bobby?" Then Bobby knew he was no longer in his bed, that he stood instead in a cold place, and the meaning of his position came with a rush of sick terror. "Get hold of yourself," Graham said. "Come back." Bobby opened his eyes. He was in the upper hall at the head of the stairs. Unconsciously he had been about to creep quietly down, perhaps to the library. Graham had awakened him. It seemed to offer the answer to everything. It seemed to give outline to a monstrous familiar that drowned his real self in the black pit while it conducted his body to the commission of unspeakable crimes. He lurched into the bedroom and sat shivering on the bed. Graham entered and quietly closed the door. "What time is it?" Bobby asked hoarsely. "2:30. I don't think Robinson was aroused." The damp moon gave an ominous unreality to the room. "What did I do?" Bobby whispered. "Got softly out of bed and went to the hall. It was uncanny. You were like an automaton. I didn't wake you at once. You see, I thought you might go to the old room." Bobby shook again. He drew a blanket about his shoulders. "And you believed I'd show the way in and out, but the room was empty, so I was going downstairs." He shuddered. "Good God, then it's all true. I did it for the money. I put Howells out to protect myself. I was going after Robinson. It's true, Hartley. Tell me, do you think it's true?" Graham turned away. "Don't ask me to say anything to help you just now," he answered huskily. "For after this, I don't dare, Bobby. I don't dare." End of chapter 6, section 2.